Hi, Sarah Childress back with you. And today I wanted to take a few moments to share my thoughts on Jane Campion's newest film, The Power of the Dog, which I believe is going to hit Netflix any moment now, sometime around December 1st, I believe. So one of the reasons I love this film is that it's such a nuanced exploration of how toxic masculinity can destroy people. And by people, I mean men, as well as women. So let's take one of the central figures of Power of the Dog, which is Phil. Now, Phil is really kind of a poster boy for toxic masculinity as an expression of deep insecurity. Because Phil is such a character. He symbolically castrates men as he actually castrates bulls. And he does this as a way really to guard his inner life and his erotic and intimate desires, because he feels like he needs to keep them hidden from a world that would clearly use them to destroy him. Unfortunately, Phil cannot live as or in or express his true self. So he tries on different personas. For example, Phi Beta Kappa at Yale in classics, one persona from his earlier days. And now it seems that he has adopted the Wild West or Old West hero persona. But Campion shows us that regardless of the persona that Phil adopts, the mask is constantly slipping. And one of the ways that we can see that the mask is slipping, and that really behind this mask, Phil is lost and alone, is the way that we see Phil constantly calling out for George. He so clearly emotionally needs his brother, whom unfortunately he also continuously insults, but it seems those insults are driven by a desire to camouflage this need, this desire to be emotionally close to someone. So even though Phil might recognize this need within himself, he's constantly bridling it, he's curbing it, he's trying to hide it and trying to perhaps even repress it or kill it within himself. So while Phil is chasing after George like a lost lamb, George seems to be inhabiting a world completely unto himself. So George has created this world that seems to isolate him from others. And you can understand that because that seems to be a way of self, like a means of self-preservation, because certainly Phil is just constantly after him whenever he doesn't have something else to distract him. But the unfortunate thing is that George's means of self-preservation has produced a kind of self-centeredness within him that keeps him distanced and safe from Phil, but also keeps him really apart and very distant from Rose. And so even though he marries her, they don't seem to have a really intimate and loving connection. He certainly seems to delight in Rose, but he doesn't really seem to be attuned to who she is and what she needs. And this might be because Rose fulfills a kind of manly, I don't even want to say like a manly drive or anything within him, but she kind of fulfills a classical desire, which is the desire to be a patriarch. And Rose does make George not only a man, but a patriarch. So her crying brings George to her, and provides him with an opportunity to save her, which he does. He marries her and takes her home. And by doing so, he then becomes the patriarch of the household. And this position is clearly established when George locks Phil out of the bathroom. And then when the couple serenades him, for lack of a better word, with their sounds of conjugal lovemaking in the next room, which drives Phil not only out of his room, the room that he had formerly shared with George, but also drives him from the house and then into the barn where he returns to his memories of Bronco Henry. So again, he's trying to almost transfer or find or fill the void that George has created, the emotional void that George kind of abandoning him has created by returning to the dream, the memory of Bronco Henry. And so because he's feeling abandoned, he's feeling powerless, Phil begins then to strike out at Rose, not at George, but at Rose. But he strikes out at her like a child would. I mean, really, when you think about what he does to her, he's kind of making fun of her and trying to annoy or embarrass her, which is really super childish. And in fact, what George does to Rose is arguably more devastating than what Phil does to her, even though Phil becomes kind of the textbook antagonist for the film. George, I would argue, is a sleeper antagonist, because for me, George essentially damns Rose to nothingness. So what I mean by that is he forces a dinner party and a piano performance onto her. And so he doesn't see, like, once the party has started and the governor and his wife is there, and now Rose's in-laws, like George's mother and father, are there. George doesn't see, or he actually ignores, Rose's visible discomfort and the fact that she doesn't even really say an entire word throughout the entire evening. And we're led to believe through Campion's very wonderful kind of scene setting and staging and blocking that one of the reasons that Rose isn't really interacting and engaging is because she's feeling completely outclassed by the governor and his wife and her new in-laws. So on top of that, like a very kind of tense and awkward evening, George then basically forces her to play the piano despite her protests. I mean, she tries her best to get out of it, but I mean, the scene is set, like everybody's getting their chair and moving from the dinner table and like, okay, like we're here, we're ready. Like you're supposed to be here fulfilling this need and showing us what you've got. And under this like incredible social pressure, it's just incredible. I mean, no wonder she can't play the piano. I mean, she gets up and she tries, but she just can't do it. And so Phil comes in and delivers a kind of curtain line on her inability, but it's really George who created the whole scenario, and not only created the whole scenario for her public shaming, but he's the one who like creates the opportunity for any perceived inadequacies on her part, whether self-perceived or socially perceived, for those to play out. And so when she tries to play the piano but fails, she's basically damned into a kind of non-existence. And this happens with really a gendered cliche delivered by the governor, which seems like a throwaway line, but it's quite important, when he says something like, "At least she's got you halter trained, George." So it's like she's been now banished into not only the cliche of what a wife is, but into a kind of nothingness where others have to like recharacterize her or reposition her. So it's no wonder that we see her pick up the drink. And with that particular moment, she is opting into alcoholism with the same kind of fervor and dedication that used to drive her work at the boarding house and her piano practicing. And so really, with nothing to occupy her time, focus, and skills at the big house, she's damned into nothingness. And so she uses bourbon to blur and compress her incredibly empty days. And then poor Peter, her son, I shouldn't say poor Peter, her son, arrives into the midst of all of this devastation and alienation. And what's so cool about Peter is a perfect casting. He's willowy of frame and pale of skin. He's tender-eyed and seems like such a man-child, but he's a wolf in sheep's clothing. No, wait, he's not a wolf in sheep's clothing. He's able to hide in plain sight. And he's able to hide because he can't be seen by those around him. Like he's not actually hiding. He's just almost imperceptible in a way. And so what is so strong and wonderful about Peter is so truly himself. Like in contrast to Phil, Peter is himself. He doesn't hide himself. He just is. And even though those around him can't see him, instead seeing what they project upon him, and what they project upon him is weakness, he's learned to cope with these hurtful projections. And you can see examples of that in his hula hooping and his kind of self-soothing cone strumming and thrumming. But not only has he learned to cope with these projections, these very hurtful projections, he's also learned to leverage them, which he does, and in doing so becomes a kind of patriarchal savior in his own right. But we have to wonder at what price to his soul, or, and more in keeping with the film, and what price to his self, because his dad did warn him that sometimes he can be too strong. And so we have to wonder if this young man who has been such a target of toxic masculinity and doesn't seem to have necessarily incorporated it within him in his expression of self, like perhaps he has, like that he's embodying a different variant of toxic masculinity, that despite all the ways that people want to project femininity upon him and weakness upon him, that in fact he is a cauldron for toxic masculinity. So I would invite you to watch this film in all of its wonderful complexity and its incredible penchant for small but beautiful and meaningful details. And I would also invite you to watch it twice. I was very lucky to see it twice on the big screen. And certainly it does have a twist. So when you watch it the first time, you'll then be aware of what the twist is. And then watching it a second time, you will be able to pick up on more of the details and see how all the characters fit together in ways that on the surface might seem kind of conventional, but when you really dive into them, you see that this really is a nuanced and complex kind of excavation or examination of not only toxic masculinity, but in general kind of domestic or intimate gender relationships. I hope you enjoy the film. See you next time.